going to just jump in and tell you that you're on mute.
Hi, thanks, Barb.
Perfect. There you are.
There I am. Thank you so much for catching that I was on mute. I didn't realize I was on mute. There we go. So thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Christine Edgecombe. I'm the chair of the Peoples with Disabilities Committee at the Hospital Employees Union. HEU represents more than 50,000 members working in all areas of the hospital employees or healthcare. And it's a great to know so many of you are on the call with us today. I'm streaming to you from the traditional and ancestral land and unceded territories of Kakite, which is in New Westminster. First Nations people. And unceded means land that was stolen and is currently being illegally occupied. It is such a great privilege for me to be on this land today. While we are online, we are all situated in places that have been stewarded by First Nations people for 10,000s of years. To learn more about traditional territories you're on, you can visit native-land.ca. With regards to the equity committees, we're actually celebrating our 25 years for HEU. So it's a huge thing to recognize this year. The People with Disability Committee is working hard on invisible disabilities, specifically mental health and addictions. I am so pleased to be introducing our workshop today on the topic of addictions from a harm reductions perspective. Addictions is a type of disability that is not talked about enough, and left unsupported has devastating impacts on individuals and communities. And so I'd like to introduce HEU Barb Netterpol, who showed up earlier, and who is going to be moderating today's panel discussion. Barb, take over.
Thanks so much, Christine, for your introduction, but honestly, for your fierce and dedicated work, not just on the People with Disabilities Committee, but also in the community. I know that this topic is something that's near and dear to your heart, so I'm really glad that you are doing the introduction this evening. And I know that there may be other folks that are also on the People with Disabilities Committee. And if you're tuning in right now, I want to make sure that you have our thanks, our gratitude for all of the great organizing work that you all do. So please feel free to share in the chat if you are with us this evening and you're part of the People with Disabilities Committee so that we can celebrate the entire group of you. Now, here in BC, the COVID crisis has been running in tangent with the opioid crisis. In 2016, following a significant increase in opioid-related overdose deaths from drug poisoning, a public health emergency was declared in BC. Since then, more than 21,000 people have lost their lives to overdoses right across this province. Now, we have two amazing expert panelists with us here tonight to discuss this topic. And I'm really pleased that we're joined by Heather McCain, who's the Executive Director of Creating Accessible Neighborhoods. Now, Heather's own experiences with multiple types of disabilities, neurodivergence, inaccessibility, and ableism led them to be a well-known and respected advocate, speaker, educator, and activist. Now, Heather is a CRIP doula. Now, this is a disability justice term for someone who helps disabled people navigate our complex systems, provide resources, find support, and build community. Heather also facilitates Chronically Queer, which is a support group for LGBTQIA+ folks with chronic health conditions. Thank you so much for joining us, Heather.
Thanks very much for having me.
I'm also delighted to be introducing Laura Track, who's the director of the Community Legal Assistance Society's Human Rights Clinic, as well as being its directors of education. So Laura advocates on behalf of people who have experienced discrimination and assists complainants to navigate BC's human rights process. She delivers workshops and presentations to a wide variety of audiences to help people understand their human rights and comply with their legal obligations. Now, Laura earned her law degree from UBC in 2006 and holds a master's in international human rights law from Oxford University. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so for the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to be, talking to our panel, just basically giving them a series of questions to stimulate a discussion. So if any of you that are tuning in tonight have any questions that arise during this conversation, please feel free to put them in the chat. And we will have about 10 minutes at the end just to answer a few questions from our members and the viewers. So my friends, if you're ready to jump in, I am. You're ready to go?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm going to put the first question to you, Laura. Tell us, please, what do people need to know about addictions from a human rights perspective? And why is it particularly relevant at this time?
Thank you for the question. It's a helpful grounding question for me to be clear about my knowledge and expertise and what I am able to sort of speak to, or at least what I do speak to in the course of my job, and what I might hold personal opinions on outside of the context of my job. So as a human rights lawyer working with the Human Rights Clinic, and doing education on human rights, one of the first points that I often have to make in the course of those workshops is that many of us have a very broad conception of human rights as a concept. We think about human rights that we are all entitled to by virtue of being human, such as the right to safety, the right to equality, the right to have our security of our person protected by government. And the work that I do at the Human Rights Clinic is a very narrow subset of that larger conception of human rights. The work that we do at the clinic is to assist people who have made human rights complaints under the Human Rights Code. And the Human Rights Code does not protect those broad human rights that we may think of when we think about the term human rights. It protects us from discrimination in our employment, in our housing, and in our access to services that are offered to the public. So sometimes that's an important sort of clarification piece, that when I am approaching complaint of a human rights violation, I have to be able to fit it into one of those boxes in order for it to be something that I can work on and something that a person can make a complaint about to the Human Rights Tribunal. So I'm going to talk about that narrow scope of human rights from my perspective as a lawyer at the Human Rights Clinic. And I may also reflect on my own personal opinions about larger human rights issues affecting people with substance use disorder, addiction disabilities, and so forth, because the human rights impacts on people of poor government policy around drug criminalization and other issues, I think, are urgent human rights issues. They just may not necessarily be issues that I work on day to day in the context of a human rights lawyer. From the perspective of a human rights complaint under the Human Rights Code, the first thing to know is that an addiction issue is what's called a protected characteristic under human rights law, or a protected ground of discrimination. It means you can't be discriminated against by your employer or your landlord or a service provider on the basis that you have an addiction. The Human Rights Code protects us from discrimination on the basis of disabilities, both physical and mental, and addiction is captured by the definition of disability in the code. And the other important thing for folks to know is that under the Human Rights Code, employers and others have what's called a duty to accommodate employees with an addiction to what's called the point of undue hardship. And so what that means is that if an employee identifies that they have a problem with substance use, the employer must explore how they can be supported. That might look like providing them with time off to attend treatment, or perhaps even paying for that treatment, depending on the size of the employer. And I think to answer your question in closing, in terms of sort of misconceptions that people may have, I think that some employers are under the impression that if someone were to, for example, show up to work intoxicated, that the employer has an immediate and uncontested right to terminate them on the spot. But it's not that simple under our human rights laws. An employer has a duty to maintain a safe workplace, and they certainly can't allow someone to work in a safety sensitive role while they're intoxicated. But terminating them on the spot may constitute discrimination against someone who has an addiction disability. Someone showing up to work intoxicated should instead trigger an employer to ask about whether they might need some help and support. An employer doesn't have to tolerate excessive risk on the job or chronic absenteeism or poor performance, but they do have a responsibility and a legal obligation to take reasonable steps and to work with a person with a substance use disorder to try and accommodate them and see what they need to support them.
That really set the table really well for this discussion, Laura. Thank you for that. So Heather, what do you think, what would you like to add to that? But also, like, why is that particularly relevant at this time?
Yeah, I think what I like to add is that a common misperception about addiction is that there's ease of use to access the care and help within the system. And that's not the case for a lot of people who have substance use. Substance use often stems from complex chronic conditions that have to do with mental health, intergenerational trauma, abuse. And when you have essentially a system that was not designed by people with that lived experience, it's a system that doesn't necessarily work for those people. And as they're often battling mental health issues or other complex health issues, trying to navigate the system and trying to have the patience and the ability to get through it when there isn't as many available advocates as is necessary is not an easy situation, and often actually worsens people's mental health. Within Chronically Queer, our group has everybody in our group says what they have, medical PTSD is what they call it. So having to interact with systems that are not made for marginalized people. And this has created such trauma within themselves that they're less willing to interact with that system. And with people who have, say, depression, 40 to 60% end up also having substance use, and 40% of those people are not likely to interact with the medical system for help because of the trauma that they have experienced. And so I think that's a big misconception, that a lot of people assume that if you have an addiction, the help is there if you really want it. And there definitely is help that's available, but whether it's available for people, in a way that they can navigate is a big issue. And I think of a quote by author Jimo Alua, who says that marginalized people will experience barriers that other populations can't even imagine, and we need to stop expecting marginalized people to have to go through all of these barriers in order to get the help that they need. I think another misconception is from the human rights is that people have inherent worth. And I think that is often an issue within kind of the ableist approach of our medical system, where worth needs to be proved over and over again. And so if you are a person with a disability, if you are a person who lives in poverty, if you have experienced, trauma or abuse, all of these make it harder to access the system. And it also makes you feel less worthy because the system sees you as such. And then it's even harder to ask for help when it's the system itself that is constantly telling you that you're not worthy. And so that's something that we really need to work towards. And I think there was a campaign in Vancouver here where there was an image of a person who used drugs, and then next to them it had identifiers like cousin, hockey player, friend, wife, that kind of thing. And that was an example of ableism in action, because it showed that people who use drugs by themselves were not seen as worthy. It wasn't until you attached a relationship to them that their worth was proven. And I think we need to understand the inherent worth that every person holds and recognize that within the systems and the structures to better really get to their lived experience and how best the systems can serve them. And I think, unfortunately, the systems have been made by people who don't necessarily have that lived experience, and we need to better integrate that.
Yeah, that was a really good reframe around ableism. Thank you for that, Heather. So further to that, Heather, so when we talk about misconceptions and how that impacts everyday life for so many different people on a very much an intersectional way, and it compounds with each and every person. How does that compound because of the pandemic? How have things changed because of this pandemic?
I think one thing is that the drug use has gone up during the pandemic for a lot of people because they've experienced, the trauma and the pandemic and how that's affected their life. There's been a loss of connections that are very vital to a lot of people. I think about the libraries as just an example, and libraries are community centers that, really connected people. That's where people were able to get access to a lot of the services. Now there's time limits, say at Burnaby Libraries, there's 45-minute time limits for being inside of the library. Some people would spend all day there. And with that comes a disconnect from community, which further aggregates the the issues that people are experiencing. I think also a lot of our members who have drug use and who have used drugs in order to get through the pandemic, there's such shame on them to be able to openly speak about this. We talk about self-care, but often self-care is such a shiny kind of version of yoga and meditation and bubble baths. For some people, self-care is drugs. And so how do we better support people who are in situations like that? Also, we have people who, are facing unique experience of marginalization through the pandemic. And I think the pandemic has certainly clarified some of those marginalizations for people. I think a lot of people who don't have these experiences now have experienced what it's like to have to interact with systems, in a time where they're going through something traumatic. People who had not previously had mental health issues, are experiencing kind of a languishing feeling, and depression rates are up. And I think people are beginning to really better talk about the cracks that are in the system. And the pandemic has really only magnified that, which has been great. But it has also created, I think, more stigma in conversations around drug use. And it's interesting because I was on Twitter yesterday, and there was the story of in the Maritimes, the police have said that people were using their entire CERB checks on drugs. And it was interesting because I was heartened to see that a lot of the responses were, if that's what people needed in order to get through this pandemic, then that's a valid way to spend that money. And that gives me hope that people are beginning to see that. And so on one hand, the pandemic has created more opportunity for conversations, but on the other hand, the people who are living it don't necessarily still feel like they have that opening to talk about their experiences, because they will still be shamed for using drugs, for not using better coping mechanisms, for not using other types of self-care. And so, yeah, I think that's something that's both is moving forward, but also needs a lot of work.
Yeah, I would agree with that. What do you think, Laura? And what do you think has changed from the pandemic?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Heather said. I think that this has been a hell of a year and a half, and folks are coping with it however they can. And people are using substances to numb and dissociate from the challenges of the last year, from the trauma that some of us have experienced over the last year. Um, and and I think it's also true that more and more people are using substances alone because of public health measures. It's more difficult to access safe injection sites, supervised consumption sites, peer support organizations that exist for people who use drugs. So there's so much more isolation, of course, happening through the pandemic, and I think that that's contributing to the ever increasing rates of overdose that we see in British Columbia month on month. The numbers just keep going up and are just incredibly devastating. From the perspective of the work that I do, I think what we're seeing is because of the isolation of workers to a certain extent, not all workers, of course, are working from home, but many workplaces have had to make significant adjustments during the pandemic. And so people are isolated from their colleagues, from supervisors and others who might be able to recognize that there could be an issue and that someone needs some support. It may be more difficult for the employer to recognize that it has a duty to accommodate an employee who may be struggling with a substance use problem. I'll also just mention that significant impact of the pandemic on the human rights system in BC and human rights complaint systems across the country is a massive deluge of complaints being made to the tribunal related to public health measures, mask wearing and vaccine mandates over the last little while. Our human rights tribunal is absolutely drowning in complaints about these public health measures, and the backlog is intense. And so it's become very difficult for complaints that are in the system or for people who are experiencing discrimination now and considering making a complaint to access that system. And it's a really unfortunate piece of advice that we have had to add to our sort of standard discussion with clients, is to tell them, if you make a complaint today, you're looking at a years-long process to resolution at the Human Rights Tribunal. It's totally unacceptable. It's incredibly frustrating for people that are experiencing discrimination and need a timely resolution of their complaint. And it's an unfortunate reality at this point, unless the Human Rights Tribunal is better resourced and quickly, the delays will continue.
Thank you so much for raising that really, really incredibly important point. Yeah, Heather, was there anything you wanted to add? Like, I saw you react as well. Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I was just nodding along. I think that's really important, that even the ways that people have to address the issues are so backlogged. And that also works as a deterrent because people will not go through with it. And so that's an issue as well.
Yeah, I
hear that all the time. 100%. It's a huge deterrent when I tell people that, yes, you have these rights on paper, but actually enforcing them in any kind of meaningful way is like a 2 to 3 year undertaking. A lot of people do just walk away. They've got much more immediate pressing concerns and things that they have to deal with in their life right now. And pursuing a human rights complaint just is completely untenable at that kind of time frame.
And I think it speaks to kind of building more distrust with the systems, because the systems say that they're there to help people, and then when people try to access them, they're told, well, yes, it's here, but no, it's not actually going to work for you, or it's going to take years of your life. And so that doesn't feel like the systems are built to actually work with you. It feels like the laws said that this had to be created, but not in kind of a realistic way that is actually going to meet the needs of the people who are using them.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate, the comments that are coming up in the chat. People are really engaged in this issue. And I just want to put it out to you again that if you have any questions for our panelists, that put them in the chat and we'll definitely come back to that. So Heather, you raised some issues already around some of the other challenges that are facing people with addictions, particularly those from an intersectional point of view. What are the biggest challenges do you think that they're facing? But then, what are some of the opportunities that are arising as a result?
Yeah, I think stigmatization is one of the biggest issues. I think there's discrimination and negative stereotypes. And these are all barriers to mental health and well-being and feeling like you can interact with the system. I think that, we have members who have anxiety attacks, just even thinking of going to talk to their doctors about things like this. I think a huge challenge is that currently, most of our members have chronic pain and narcotics are covered, but counseling isn't, massage isn't, physiotherapy isn't. And so on one hand, the system is telling them that they need to not use drugs, but on the other hand, it's only covering drugs. And this is, really frustrating. I think also in order for people to be able to get off drugs, if that's what they want to do, there needs to be better support afterwards. Like, are they going to be able to have access to counseling? Are they going to be able to have culturally safe counseling? Are they, if they're Black, are they going to be able to access a Black counselor? And this is one thing in Vancouver, but especially, geographical accessibility is a big issue as well. So what kind of access to healthcare do you have when you move outside of Vancouver and into the smaller community? And will you be able to find somebody that can help you there? I think one of the opportunities that we have is for working with people who are most affected. And that's one of the key parts of disability justice is leadership must be from those who are most impacted. They are the ones who have gone through the system. They are the ones who have seen how the system actually works. There's how the system was developed, and then there's how the system actually works on the ground. And those aren't always kind of as seamlessly connected as we would like them to be. And so we really need to hear from people with that lived experience. And part of the stigma is that lived experience is less valuable than, say, a degree. And we really need to kind of combine those two and have us working collectively. And that's something that a lot of our members say is that as someone with lived experience, they'll be brought into a consultation where they're asked to give their opinions for 2 hours, and then there's never any follow through, and there's never any kind of, they don't get to see the report that came out of it, and they aren't given any kind of appreciation in terms of being paid. And so even when they try to participate, it actually stigmatizes them further because they feel like they're being a box that has to be checked off as opposed to actual meaningful participation. And so I think we have the opportunity to change that. And I think there are a lot of people who want to change that and are beginning to value lived experience more. I think one opportunity we really need to talk about is having, the supports that are necessary in order for people to fully access their best life, which is safe housing, which is feeling safe and secure within themselves. And that may be therapy. It may be just, there's so much that can be done from the medical side where we need to cover things and have people have better support. And I saw in the comments, someone said that, it takes $18,000 to go into recovery, and most don't even have enough money to live. And that's part of the problem is so many of our members live in poverty, and the weight of that is absolutely exhausting. That trying to access, the systems, especially when these additional barriers are added on, are really hard. And so I think working with people who have the lived experience to find out what those barriers are and how we can eliminate them, and also to better support them through the healthcare services that are available. And I think also there is a nice trend towards more training for people going into healthcare services to learn more about marginalized people. And I think that's really good. I do think that ableism is often left off, though, and we really need to connect ableism with the medical system. And I would like to see a lot more disability awareness within that education.
That's great. We're going to come back to that point in the next question, but I'm going to give Laura a chance to answer the question as well. Laura, what are the biggest challenges and opportunities that you see in this?
I love how Heather talked about the need, the critical importance of involving people with lived experience in the development of policy and practice. And they framed it as an opportunity. And I appreciate that framing because I had it as a huge challenge. And in my mind, a significant cause of why we're in the drug poisoning crisis that we're in today is a failure to include and meaningfully engage with people with lived experience. I think that there is often lip service to the idea of nothing about us without us, but I don't think it's sufficiently made real in the work that policymakers are doing. And this is where I may sort of broaden my human rights lens on these things beyond just the code and human rights complaints, and speak from my own sort of personal view about these things, because they are human rights issues, whether or not they're covered by the Human Rights Code. One example of recent policy change that was apparently developed without any consultation or engagement with the people it was likely to affect was a change in the methadone that is prescribed to people who have had opioid use disorder and are taking methadone as a medication to help prevent them from relapsing into use of criminalized substances. Well, government in BC, in its infinite wisdom, decided to take people off of methadone and put them on a different substance called methadose. And when that substance failed to actually meet people's needs, and people were finding themselves waking up in withdrawal, and they were telling their doctors and other medical professionals about this experience, they were brushed off and ignored. And my understanding, I'm not an expert on these issues, but my understanding from listening and reading about them is that hundreds, if not thousands of people relapsed to heroin and other criminalized opioid drugs because their methadone no longer worked for them. And that no doubt contributed to hundreds, if not thousands, of overdoses. So just such a crystal clear example of government failure to take account of the lived experience, the voice, the advocacy of people who use drugs in the development of policies. Now, eventually, they started to get there, and some people have been able to get back onto their methadone, but it took a very long time and many deaths, frankly, that are, in my mind, directly attributable to that policy change. And there are just so many other examples of the challenges in preparing for this question. I found it very easy to come up with challenges and difficulties around these issues. Government policy related to a safe supply. We're in the midst of a drug poisoning crisis, and have been for years, and the government has moved agonizingly slowly to address the contamination of the criminalized drug supply and to provide safer alternatives. In the most recent coroner's report that came out last month, there were 184 overdose deaths in July. And despite incredible advocacy from so many people, government continues to drag its feet to address this issue, and people continue to die. And there are just no shortage of other bad policies, like something called red zoning, folks might be aware of, where people, as a condition of their bail or their release from jail, are prevented from going to certain neighborhoods, which prevents their access to supervised injection sites and other forms of healthcare, police harassment of drug users, confiscating people's drugs, the criminalization of poverty and heavy-handed enforcement of laws that criminalize poverty. These push people who use drugs into the margins of our communities where they are less safe and incredibly vulnerable. So, I think there is an opportunity in the advocacy that is happening to shift. And I see these shifts happening to a certain extent from a law and order criminalization approach to a healthcare approach to substance use. I think increasingly there is recognition that addiction is not a criminal justice issue. It's a health issue. And it's not an issue that police and jails and courts are ever going to appropriately address. So that gives me some hope that there's increased recognition of the fact that we cannot police our way out of the drug poisoning crisis. And in fact, police and the criminal legal system exacerbates the problem. And I also think there are real opportunities to listen to the groups doing this work, like Moms Stop the Harm, for example, and other organizations that are advocating on behalf of people who use drugs for sound government policy and for approaches to drug use that center the health and well-being of people who use substances. Oh, you're still muted, Barb.
It was my turn to do that. Okay, thanks, Laura. So you brought up some really, really valid and important points, especially around the challenges. Do you think that there's any initiatives that are being taken right now that are working? And do you think they're working? And if not, what can we do?
Is that one to me again?
Yeah, let's go with you, Laura.
To start off, I see glimmers of really promising initiatives. There are some folks, not very many, but a few in Vancouver who are able to access a safe supply of criminalized opioid drugs. But while it's a small number, it's certainly proving the point that and providing evidence that these types of approaches to addiction work well. The city of Vancouver has taken some, what I view as promising action, requesting an exemption from a provision of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act that would decriminalize the possession of illicit drugs in Vancouver. They engage a really fantastic individual as their drug policy advisor, Karen Ward, to give them input and guidance on citywide drug policy. I think that's a very positive thing that the municipal government here in Vancouver has done. And I'm heartened, I'm biased because I come from a legal perspective. I'm also heartened by the litigation that's been filed. A group filed litigation against the government a couple of months ago saying that criminalizing drugs is a human rights violation. And that's at very early stages. But I think, litigation is not the solution to all of our problems by any stretch, but it can often foster discussion. It can raise the profile of and the perception amongst the public of the importance of these issues. It can provide an education function. And so I'm glad to see that organizations and advocates are sort of taking a by every means necessary kind of approach to the crisis of drug poisoning in British Columbia and across Canada, and advocating with government, taking things to court, and really fighting for the recognition of, again, these broader human rights than what I might get to work on a sort of day-to-day basis, but to have security and to have a right to life, to have the right to survive in the context of this drug poisoning crisis.
That's fantastic. So to you, Heather, do you know of any initiatives that are being undertaken? And what do you think about if they're working or not? Oh, Heather's now on mute.
There we go. The first thing that came to mind for me was the Open Heart Collaborative, which is a peer-run community group that's focused on trauma-informed care and education. And it is people who use drugs and have experienced drug use who are doing the advocating. And I think this is something that gives me hope, is that we are having more people with lived experience who are organizing themselves and not waiting for the system to ask for them to be part of meaningful participation. They're saying, okay, we're going to organize ourselves into, whether it's peer-run groups or nonprofits, and really start addressing some of these issues and trying to get in the room to more places to have these conversations. And I think it's, I was at an event where some members of Open Heart Collaborative were talking, and I think just the work they're doing to destigmatize discussion about drug use and how the experiences are different. They had somebody who spoke of the fact that they are the only family member who has survived intergenerational trauma, and they survived through drug use, that it was something that numbed the pain. It was something that allowed them to get to a better place in their life, to find the proper supports, to then be able to stop their drug use. And yet there's such stigma attached to them saying that drug use was a positive thing in their life. And so I think that's a big thing, is seeing people with lived experience saying, we're not going to be quiet anymore. We're not going to wait to be invited. We're going to, for a seat at the table, we're going to build our own table, and we're going to have these discussions, and to see more organizations begin to acknowledge these people and have them at events, and really work with them in collaborative ways, is something that I think is going to move us forward. And I think the more people that we have with lived experience speaking to this, the more perspectives that we have, the more we're going to be able to help people, because I think certain voices have been heard in this discussion, and a lot of voices have been left out. And so it's great to see that there is more of a perspective on how intersecting identities affect people's experience. And those intersecting identities, it can be race, age, geographic location, poverty, disability, all sorts of things. And I think that's really good.
I love that, building your own table. That's fantastic. So, so both of you mentioned the Open Heart Collaborative and the Mums Stop the Harm. We'll get those put into the chat so that other people can check those resources out. So, Heather, can you tell us, what can people do? What can I do? What can the general public do? And where can we go for more learning and resources? How can we get involved?
It's a good question. I mean, I think one of the big things is we need to learn more about ableism. We need to learn about how our systems and structures place less worth on certain people. And how it makes it harder for those people to ask for help in a system that sees them as less worthy. And I think until we really explore the ableism that is a part of our society, some of these issues are not going to be addressed. I think disability has been perceived as kind of a special interest group, but we're the largest minority in the world. We're the third largest economic power behind China and Russia. We're 25% of the non-Indigenous population in Canada, 30 to 35% of Indigenous people identify as disabled. And And so this is a huge issue that we need to address. And a lot of drug use stems from ableism, from disability, from ongoing mental health issues. And we need to see how that shows up in the work that we do. And I will plug my organization here because we do disability awareness and disability justice workshops. One thing that we also do is we have imposter syndrome workshops, because we heard from so many people who have lived experience that they felt like imposters when they were welcomed into rooms, and they didn't feel like they had a voice at the table. They felt intimidated. They felt like if they didn't have certain criteria, if they didn't match that criteria, that they were being invited as a box to check, and they didn't feel like they could speak up for themselves. And so we talk about how imposter syndrome is an actual thing that's built into our systems. It's not a personal problem, it's a societal problem. And so how do we better support others in bringing their full self and full voice to the table? And I think we need to think about how our own thoughts about drug use have, where are they created? Where do they stem from? What is some of the stigma that's attached to it? What are some of the things that we've, had to reconsider? A conversation that we have with people often, because we do include drug use as a disability in our disability awareness workshops, is a conversation about people who don't want to donate money to people who are unhoused because they think they'll use it for drugs and alcohol. And a conversation of like, how is that up to you to decide how a person is going to look after themselves? And that is stigma. That is people who will not give money to an unhoused person because they're going to spend it on alcohol, and they'll save that money and then go to the liquor store themselves. And it's somehow okay for them to buy liquor and help have that as a coping mechanisms, but it's not for other people. So thinking about where that stigma shows up within our own work, I think having conversations with other people, this is something we need to bring out from the darkness. I think there needs to be more conversations about this. And I think we don't get to actually explore our own bias until we have conversations with other people and really talk to people. And I think we need to have like concrete and targeted steps to ensure better access to healthcare, to ensure that people are having the support that they need in order to have their needs taken care of. And I think things like intergenerational trauma really needs to be looked at. I think, we've all, watched as the remains have been discovered at the residential schools, but there's been no help by any government in order to better help the Indigenous, with a mental health, with culturally safe and appropriate mental health care. And we really need to address that if we're going to address drug use as well. I think there needs to be better ongoing care. Often, in times of crisis, mental health care is dropped in, but it's not sustained, and it's not ongoing, and it's not accessible for a lot of people. And that's something that we really need to look at, is the accessibility of the system. And I think we are leaving too many people behind. And I know a lot of people who work in the healthcare system who don't want that to happen anymore and are trying to work. And I think, conversations like this are really important too, so that we can, hear people's different perspectives. And, I've loved listening to Laura, who comes at this from a very different angle than I do. And it's great to hear, what both her personal and work experience are with this, because that's how we grow within our own knowledge of understanding where it is that our perspective is, and then broadening that.
Yeah, I can absolutely appreciate that. It's also really great that we're not getting any questions in the chat. What we're having is a conversation in the chat, and even more perspectives. So I really appreciate people participating with this conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Laura. What can people do to get involved, and where can we get more resources and more learning on this?
Yeah. I love that question, and maybe as we turn things into the Q&A, I can pop a couple of links just to organizations that I'm aware of that are advocating on behalf of justice for people who use drugs, including the BC Association of People on Methadone, the Drug Users Liberation Front, Moms Stop the Harm is one that I mentioned earlier, and all of them have information and material that you can access to learn more. I'll also say the resource that I have probably learned the most from over the last couple of years about drug policy and its impacts on people who use drugs is a podcast called Crackdown. It's amazing. It is incredibly informative, and I love it. And I look forward to each new episode so much. They come out semi-regularly, and it is a project led by a number of folks associated with VANDU, which I should have mentioned in my list of organizations. VANDU might be the group that's been around for the longest. They're the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users, and have been advocating for the human rights of people who use drugs for a long time. The other thing I'd really encourage folks to do, just picking up on some of Heather's comments around like looking at your own biases and places where stigma comes up, and encouraging others to do the same. I was really disappointed by the conversations that I heard in my community of Vancouver, and specifically in Strathcona, last year, while there was a pretty significant encampment happening in a park here in East Vancouver. And the rhetoric around the people who lived there, unhoused, many living in poverty and living with addictions, was extremely distressing. And it was stoked by media and fed by politicians for partisan gain. And one thing that I hope folks will consider is that we are moving into a year of a municipal election, and I fully anticipate that there will be efforts to sort of capitalize on fear and opposition to supportive housing and treatment options for people who use drugs and so forth in communities. And I hope that the folks on this call will be the voice of reason in support of those who are marginalized in our communities, who have a right to housing, who have a right to healthcare, who belong in all of our communities, and will use your voices to speak up to council in favor of the development of the supportive housing facility in your neighborhood, or drug treatment option being proposed for your community. These are life-saving measures that really are human rights, and folks rely on, and that make our communities better and stronger. And I think all of us have a role in sort of speaking up in favor of these things, and opposing and speaking back to the voices that would perpetuate the stigma and discrimination that people who use drugs and who live in poverty experience.
Yeah, you've both listed some really great resources, and thank you to our behind the scenes staff that are madly putting it into the chats in both YouTube and in Facebook. There is one more that's the community or creating accessible neighborhood one as well. We'll get that into the chat. There it is. Perfect. Good. Those are some great resources. Click on those resources and check them out later. And we're just about out of time, but I want to give you some space to talk about, what is it that gives you hope? There's got to be some hope at the end of this. So Heather, I would love to hear from you.
Yeah, at the end of the day, I've been running my organization since 2005, and I always answer this question the same, which is people. People give me hope, because in this work, it can burn you out. It can be disheartening. It can be exhausting. But to see the amount of people who are truly trying to create a better tomorrow is really heartening. And I'm seeing more conversations that are including people with lived experience. I am seeing a better valuing of people with lived experience. I'm seeing that people with disabilities are having more voice, and social media has been really interesting for that, because it's really given an avenue for a lot of people who previously didn't have a way to get their voice out into the community. And, you know, on the really tough days, it's community that supports me and community that supports other people. And I think that's what gives me hope. I think there's so many people who are doing great work, and whether they work within the system or outside of the system, or have, you know, are people with lived experience. There are people who are genuinely trying to work together, and we just kind of have to work more collectively and work with government in order to have these changes actually enacted, and enacted in ways that are accessible and available to people. I think also people who are trying to break cycles really gives me hope as well. We have a lot of members who are doing a lot of hard work in order to break family cycles, abuse cycles, trauma cycles. And it gives me hope to see people who are willing to put in that work, who are willing to, you know, really break down some of the things that are so inherent in how they were raised. That it's incredible to see people, and it just makes me want to do this work even more, to see how much they're willing to put into trying to make their lives better, especially if they have children or loved ones that they want to do this for. And so, yeah, at the end of the day, it's always people that give me hope.
Oh, that's a beautiful concept. I love that. Laura, what gives you hope?
I love that too. Yeah, I would echo that. The work that's happening, the advocacy, and the folks that, you know, despite so many challenges, are not giving up and are continuing to speak truth to power and fight in the ways they can, and to push back. And the fact that this conversation is happening gives me hope. The fact that I have learned so much in the last hour from Heather and from folks in the chat sharing their thoughts and experiences, this session makes me feel hopeful. So thank you very much.
I would have to echo that as well. What gives me hope is that both of you are out there doing the work that you do. We deeply appreciate it. And I know that the people that you touch and you support and you help on a daily basis really appreciate every effort that both of you have made. You know, I hate that we're out of time. We have to wrap things up. I just want to thank both of you so much for such an incredible, rich conversation, and to our members and the participants for joining with us today and participating in the chats. And of course, to the People with Disabilities Committee. I know like almost all of you are here. We've got Donna, Tracy, Tina, and Barbara have been watching, as well as Christine. So I want to again thank them for the work that they do. You know, these are the folks in our union that have furthered this kind of work within the union, and they were the ones who advocated to have this really important conversation. So really a big thank you to our committee for this. And we want to hear from those of you that have been watching about how this session went for you. So please fill out the feedback form, which we're going to put in the chat for you. And I got to say this, I'm almost tearing up thinking about this, that, you know, we've been running these webinars for the last 5 weeks, and this is our final one. And for me, it's been such an incredible journey of learning and deep inspiration. So I want to thank everyone again for joining us over these weeks and taking the time to engage in these really important topics that matter and affect us all. And when we come together in solidarity, we all become stronger, better, and we can change the world. So thank you again to our panelists and to everybody else. It's been a wonderful evening. Enjoy the rest of your night.
Thank you
so much.